Hi students, this is Dr. Garcia, and I just wanted to run through a module with you and give you some background information. So thanks for your patience as we're all adjusting to the course. I appreciate you getting familiar with the course and taking the first quiz, and that you are starting to review the course material. So I want to talk to you a little bit about Module 1, because now you really should have gotten your textbook, you should be familiar with Blackboard, and in Module 1, I'm really asking you for quite a bit of information. I'm also asking you to review the United States Constitution and to compare it with the Texas Constitution and its multiple parts. So, when you think of the U.S. Constitution, I imagine that many of you are familiar with various amendments that make up the Bill of Rights. You may be familiar with the freedom of speech and assembly and the right to not self-incriminate, which is the Fifth Amendment. And perhaps one of the easiest amendments to remember is the right to bear arms, which has been in the national news lately. So I would encourage you to think about which amendments you're familiar with, and do you have a favorite amendment, like one that you really value? It's important to point out that the United States Constitution is much easier to read and follow than the Texas Constitution. The United States Constitution is not complicated in sentence structure. The language is clear, and it's not very detailed, and things are listed in the order of importance. So Congress, which was considered the most important branch of government, is listed first. It's also important to discuss the reading level of the United States Constitution. It's easy to understand, easy to read, right? The Texas Constitution was written in 1876, and the United States Constitution was written in 1787. The Texas Constitution is very wordy, very complicated, and I've asked you to look at some of the different portions of it. They use a lot of words just to get the point across, which is the exact opposite of the United States Constitution. So you'll notice that many of the same Bill of Rights from the US Constitution are in the Texas Constitution. But the Texas Constitution goes into a lot more detail. It makes reference to libel, which is a false statement that you can make of someone that might cause harm, and the United States Constitution does not. The Texas Constitution also makes reference to freedom of worship, which includes God in the preamble, and it mentions the importance to hunt and fish and harvest wildlife. So those are important to keep in mind. I'm giving you a little graphic that's not the best graphic, I get it, about the United States Constitution and the Texas Constitution. So I'm just going to encourage you to review it, and I trust that you all will take a look at this when you have a moment. It's also, and then I also provide you with a little bit of like similarities in this next slide, which is also not the best graphic. But these are helpful to keep in mind, you know, as you differentiate between the US Constitution and the Texas Constitution. So it's also really important for you to think about federalism, which you should have learned from your American politics class, and the diversity of the state of Texas. If you remember from your American government course, federalism is the division of power between federal and state governments. So specific powers are given to the US federal government, and other powers are reserved for the states. Some examples of these powers include the way like public employees are elected or appointed, the way federal funds are spent, and if accommodations need to be made for special populations like crime victims. So I really want you to focus on chapter 1 of the textbook and be able to identify the ways that Texas is a diverse state. I'm not sure if any of you watched the Ellen show, but the El Paso Congressional Representative Beto O'Rourke was on Ellen, and he mentioned how diverse Texas is. And in the lecture notes that I'm going to share with you, I'm providing you a link in case you want to view that. So think about what makes Texas diverse and use the schema provided by the authors in the textbook as the differences as related to politics. So political culture is the way people understand politics and what they think leaders and voters should do. So make sure to review slides 7 and 8 of chapter 1. And they have a lot, there's tons of great information in all of the chapter 1 slides. And I'll probably end up talking a little bit more about 1 or 2 of the topics. It's helpful to reflect on the Texas political culture, right? And as you're doing that, think about what you think is important for a state government to do. So, and when you interact with a government agency, what does that mean to you? So, for example, do you think voters should have more say in policies than elected leaders? Do you trust leaders to make decisions for you, even if none of them have ever talked with you or have visited El Paso? Have you had experiences with state agencies like the police department, the Department of Motor Vehicles? And if so, how have those interactions been? Like, do you leave feeling happy or frustrated or angry? Think about that. So also, when you think about Texas as a state, the things that should come to mind in terms of diversity are industry, geography, racial and ethnic makeup of the counties, farming and wildlife, access to water, rural and urban areas, and proximity to other states and nations. This is super helpful for thinking about your next quiz. And also in the lecture notes, I'm providing you with a snapshot of Texas, which I'm taking from the U.S. Census. And if you don't know, the U.S. Census is a federal survey distributed around the country. And the survey is used to better understand people, economic needs, access to services, and most importantly, to draw election maps. The census is a way for people, for parties to redraw election maps to their advantage, which is really relevant to this course, and we'll end up talking about it a little bit later in some of the middle chapters. So I wanted to highlight a few of the slides from chapter 1 and just talk about them briefly. So the Texas political culture, it assumes that Texans have shared values, beliefs, attitudes, and how we should function, right? And political culture in the United States, according to Daniel Elazar, means that there has to be moral values, individualistic values, and traditional values. So they go a little bit more into this in the textbook, of course. So the moralistic cultures is the concern of everyone, right? Like government should promote good for everyone and public good. The individualistic way of looking at government means that politics should only matter to professionals and the role of government is strictly limited to whatever they want to promote. And the government's role is to ensure that individuals can pursue their own interest. So if it's good for me, that's all that matters. It doesn't matter if it's bad for you. And so those are the difference between the moralistic and the individualistic political cultures. The traditionalistic political culture is government is run by an established elite, and it reflects the values of when slavery was big in Texas and a way of life. And this indicates that this is the way we've always managed our government, and therefore that's the way we're going to do it again. And there's no change in Texas political culture. So those are 3 different ways of looking at understanding of Texas politics. It's helpful for you to keep this in mind and think about which one you belong to. So there's been a few kind of economic topics that we should know about for Texas, and one of them is the importance of cotton. And it's not so much as relevant anymore, but it's still part of the Texas economy. And those numbers fell in the Great Depression, and so we'll talk a little bit more about different economies and how they've affected Texas. So cotton's important. A quarter of cotton was produced in the United States, and it comes from Texas. And so you can see a graphic of machinery that helps farm cotton. The other thing that I think people kind of forget that's important to Texas economy is cattle, and a history of ranching and cattle is very similar to the way cotton was important to the Texas economy. This was following the Civil War. It was super important. But funny enough, neither cotton or ranching are as important as they were in the past, but they're still a big part of the Texas culture. So that's really helpful to keep in mind, too, as you're thinking about Texas economy. I guess one of my favorite things to talk about in the state of Texas is the way in which technology has really changed. So Dell is now located right outside of Austin, and Texas Instruments is also located in Dallas. So just like there's Silicon Valley in California, there's said to be a big high-tech industry boom in the state of Texas. So for those of you that are undeclared majors, think about some of these high-tech jobs and industries, because A, you can stay in Texas, and B, you'll be guaranteed a job within the state. So we should also talk a little bit about NAFTA, since that's an important part for Texas economy. And this was signed in '92, and it's essentially a free trade zone between or among the United States, Canada, and Mexico. So we can talk a little bit more about this towards the end of the class, because I think we need a firm understanding of our relationship with Canada and Mexico that we're not quite ready to go into. But NAFTA really changed the way in which we imported and exported. And so for Texas economy, exports, like what we shipped out to Canada and Mexico, and even around the world, really changed because of NAFTA. The role of the military is also super important in Texas. I want to show you this map. For any of you that are serving in the military, this might look familiar to you, but there's a variety of bases, military bases in Texas, and this has always been the case, and Texas has been closely tied to the expansion of military in its history. So this is just a different way to think about the different bases and the way in which they've evolved in Texas. So this has different years that you might want to look at, and the number of civilian employees that are employed by a particular base. So that's, you can see, like Fort Sam Houston at one point had 8,687 civilians employed. Obviously, the numbers change as the bases kind of expanded. And you can see Fort Bliss opened in 1849, and it has 4,125 civilian employees. So clearly, military bases provide civilians with quite a bit of jobs. The last thing I wanted to mention was the Great Recession, and this is different from previous recessions in the entire country, because this one we're talking about a housing boom. So I don't know if some of you purchased houses or remember when the housing bubble burst, but essentially there was predatory lenders, and if you wanted to buy a home or a second home or a third home, you could get a high interest rate but still have a loan payment, as long as there was still banks willing to lend to particular people. So this is really dangerous, because what happens when banks run out of money and can't lend anymore, they're going to expect some of those payments back. And of course, not everybody could pay for their second or third home or even their first home. And that's what led to the housing bubble bursting. It's a lot more complicated, but you can always watch the movie The Big Short, and that explains it really, really well in fun economic terms. But it's important to think about when you're thinking about the Texas economy. So these are just some of the slides that I'm highlighting for you. I encourage you to review all of the material. You will be tested on all of the material, but I just wanted to share a few thoughts about Texas economy, the diversity, and some of the information to get you started on Module 1. I hope this was helpful, and thanks so much.